This is a Pulp Archive recording. All public Pulp Archive recordings are licensed under Creative Commons. For more information or to support us, please visit patreon.com/pulparchive. This episode was prepared by Soul and narrated by Edward, the digital narrator. Hurtling Horror by Earl W. and Marion Scott. Weird Tales. June, 1926. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. It was midnight. Gray fog hung low over Lake Michigan, curling up dark canyons of deserted streets. Rarely a figure slipped through the gloom. A taxi skidded round a corner, but mostly the city slept. Salisbury Quinn cursed and drew his heavy coat closer. "Damn! Why didn't I come in the car?" He paused in the shadow of the elevated where it topped the street and glanced furtively around, striving to pierce the sticky gloom. His fastidiously dressed figure offered a striking contrast to his surroundings. The gleam of a half-carat stone on his delicate hand caught the light as he settled the silken muffler around his throat. A feeling of uneasiness stole over him. He was unused to lonely spots at night. The echo of hurrying footsteps reached him. Then from somewhere in the heavy framework above came a low, whining sound. Suddenly he was horribly afraid. His hands fumbled toward a pocket where he had secreted an automatic. He had a notion of running from the spot. He tried to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. The gun stuck stubbornly. Then, like an avalanche, it struck him. His stunned senses registered a horrid wheezing, a human thing crashing onto his shoulders from somewhere in the dark regions of the elevated above. Then he went down, striking vain blows, clawing, twisting in the shadow pool on the pavement. He felt consciousness going. He turned a blood-stained, congested face upward as he fainted. For a terrible moment, his horrified eyes gazed at the thing above him. Flashes of fire darted across his numbing brain. There was a long, shuddering cry, and his rumpled, ravaged figure lay alone in its pool of shadows and blood. A fog whistle rustily split the night. Salisbury Quinn was dead. Chicago was stirred, especially in banking circles, at the murder of one of its most respected members. How had the man met his horrible death? What was he doing in the unsavory district of 32nd Street at that time of night? Robbery was out of the question. A well-filled billfold, a magnificent diamond ring, a valuable watch. All were found in place when Officer Flynn discovered his still, warm body under the elevated crossing. There was no trace of his murderer, no clue as to the manner of his killing, except the torn throat and lacerated face. Chicago was shocked. Chicago was horrified. A respectable gunning, a plain case of sandbagging, an ordinary knifing. Yes, that could be countenanced. But what criminal killed his victim in this outre way and left everything of value upon him? There were two explanations possible: revenge or insanity. Someone had hated Quinn. Someone had followed and leaped upon him from the dark. Someone had delighted in mutilating his body, or else a very careful survey of all hospitals for the insane was made. It was possible that a dangerous madman was at large, lurking in hiding through the day, striking at night without reason. Nothing came of it. There were various shadowed chapters in Quinn's life, but nothing to warrant such a deed. The hospitals had nothing to report. On general principles, crooks were corralled. Stool pigeons third-degreed. Hangouts of well-known underworld characters were combed, all to no avail. Then again the horror struck. This time it was on the north side. Flossie Wren, sophomore at Northwestern University, was returning to her rooming place on Fullerton Avenue. She had quarreled with her fiancé and insisted on returning home unescorted, leaving the dance warm and furious. She had taken the elevated and dismounted at Fullerton Station alone. It was late, and she was the only passenger, except a shabby youth who hugged himself into a corner and watched the girl. As she entered the shadow at the foot of the elevated stairs, she drew back with a slight shiver, never afraid of darkness. She vaguely wondered at this sudden timidity. There was a suggestion of evil emanating from the black passageway. Then, with a toss of her bobbed golden hair, she plunged into the gloom. At once the feeling of danger deepened. For a moment she hesitated, considered, turning back. Then the blackness dissolved into lighter murk, and she saw the passageway absolutely empty. With sharply drawn breath and clicking teeth, she started to run. Her steps echoed bleakly on the pavement. A cold wind swept through the tunnel like opening. Flossie choked back a little cry. The exit was just before her. Her sharp scream was cut short, as she was crushed against the stones by a terrible, hissing weight. Stunned almost to unconsciousness, she still managed to struggle feebly for a few sickening moments, her thick fur protecting her throat. Then resistance left her. Like steel hooks, something fastened into the soft flesh. Her wide blue eyes mirrored an agile, writhing shape above her. Then, with a tiny whimper, she quivered and relaxed. Above, the elevated train roared and shrieked to a stop. Fred Fulmer, hurrying down the steps and under the platform, stumbled across something soft and still. A hastily struck match sent him back with a gasp of horror. "Flossie Wren!" he gasped, gazing at the pitiful figure. "She roomed on the floor above me." The papers flared with the second murder, this time a girl, a student at the university. What was the matter with the police? This young girl's life snuffed out in a respectable quarter of the city. All evidence led to the same cause as the death of Salisbury Quinn. The conditions were virtually the same. What was to be done? Double the police force, increase the vigilance. The city was alarmed. Some unknown menace threatened its dwellers. Warnings were issued against solitary pedestrians returning home at late hours. Northwestern University placed a ban against all dances and parties. The students must stay indoors at night. People returning home from the theaters by way of the elevated entered the passageways warily, and usually in groups. 2 days passed. The police worked doggedly. On nothing. Captain Lynch frowned at the morbid pictures of the murdered girl, her helpless body lying on the sidewalk. There was a small inset of her in tennis togs, golden bob, confined by a broad band of ribbon. He glowered at her lovely, smiling face. Space was given to her grief-stricken parents, just arrived from a small town out west. Her funeral was the subject of half a page. Captain Lynch bit so viciously on his cigar that the chewed end snapped off. He not only writhed under the jibes of the papers, but in his heart was a bitter anger against this unknown thing that had already taken its remorseless toll. There was a quick tap on the door. Lynch growled, "Admittance." A young man entered, and the glum face of the captain relaxed. He grinned and kicked out a chair. "Hello, Larry. What's the row?" Larry O'Toole was one of the latest additions to the detective force. The captain believed in him, but up to this time he had had little opportunity to show what he could do. He eased his long length into the chair. "Well, Captain, it's about this L business, this horror scare." "Sure, everything's about that. Look here." The captain flicked a stubby finger at the morning paper. Larry nodded sympathetically. "Yes, and the news is worse." "Well, I've got a clue." Lynch's face brightened. "Sure? Surest thing, you know. I know what caused the 2 deaths. All I've got to do is to find the thing." "Thing?" "That's what I said. Didn't think it was a man, did you not? On your amiable existence, it's a beast." Lynch leaned forward. "You mean—" "Yes, I do. An ape. I said so from the first." Lynch settled back, the scowl in place again. "Oh, hell, Larry, you been reading that guy Poe with his big noise about those Rue Morgue murders. Where in time could an ape come from in Chi? I am coming to that. The manner of Quinn's death was so unusual that I could not imagine a human being responsible for it. You saw the wounds? Lynch nodded distastefully. Well, Doc, Amherst told me they resembled rents made by the claws of a wild beast, not such a creature as a lion or tiger. For, if it were possible for such a thing to leap out from the shadow of the L, he would most likely use his teeth, and the whole throat would be torn out. In this case, the flesh was torn to ribbons, as if ripped by sharp knives. But Amherst said that in his opinion, death came from choking, the throat tearing being done after life was extinct. What makes him think that? Oh, it's technical, of course. But he explained that in death from strangulation, circulation to and from the brain is impeded. As a result, the face is pallid, the eyes are usually prominent, the tongue sometimes protrudes, and the hands are generally clenched. These symptoms were all present in the case of Quinn. In the girl, the only one lacking was the protruding tongue, possibly due to the fact that she went out easier, hence strangulation. And, after choking them to death, the devil deliberately tore their throats. Ugh! The big officer, accustomed for nearly 20 years to scenes of violence and death, rose abruptly, jamming his hands into his pockets, and began a restless pacing of the room. My God, Larry, it's awful. Well, where does this ape stuff come from? As I told you, the idea of an animal's being responsible for the deaths struck me from the first. I straightway started out to find the animal. It took some work, but there is a dinky little circus in winter quarters out beyond Lake Bluff, and today I found them. The manager's a Dago, and he was scared to death. Couldn't get a thing out of him at first, but finally I bluffed him into spilling. Seems that a big ape escaped from them a week ago, just a day before Quinn was killed, in fact. This Dago chap had been trying to locate him, as he's valuable. Then when the news of the crime came out, he was so scared, he just shut up the poor dumbbell, instead of coming and telling us and letting us catch the thing. He says the animal has never been vicious, but its keeper got nasty and beat the brute badly, so it cunningly worked apart the bars of its cage and slipped out. He says if frightened and hungry, it would most likely become dangerous, and might take its anger out against anyone who happened in its way. I've got the boys scouring the city, and any minute I expect word that they've located it. Then a quick bullet, and the terror by night will be gone. Lynch took a deep breath. Good Lord, Larry, I hope you are right. I don't know much about the brutes, but it does seem to me that it would have taken to the trees instead of wandering into the heart of the city, miles and miles. Larry grinned. Or, come on, Lynch, you are crediting the thing with too much sense. How's an ape to know that pavement and streetcars mean city? He runs away the first way that presents itself. You say it's been out a week? Darned funny. No one has seen it. Someone has seen it. 2 little girls out that way, scared out of their senses by a great hairy brute walking up and taking their bananas away from them. It bared its ugly fangs at them and ran away behind a billboard on an empty lot. Some of the men went out with guns, but couldn't locate it. It was near dark. Funny they didn't say anything about it. They did. It was one of the men that told me, and I found the circus from that. It's all right, Captain. That's the culprit. I hope you are right. The telephone whirred sharply. Lynch jerked down the receiver. Hello? Who 02? Sure, he's here. He stood back impatiently while Larry spoke swiftly and excitedly, then turned with a satisfied grunt. It's all over, Captain Henry, and Flanagan got the thing cornered in a vacant building. They're trying to take it alive, but will shoot before running any risks. I am going out. Hooray, the big case is over. Too bad it couldn't have happened before. He was out the door before the sentence was finished. Officer Flanagan stood with smoking revolver, looking down at a huge, ungainly beast that lay in an ugly welter of blood on the floor of a deserted barn. "Well, there it is, Larry. I'll say we did a good day's work. That Dago Tom came and tried to get the thing peaceable, but it was no use. It screamed and fought like a devil, and we had to shoot it." Larry shuddered involuntarily as he gazed at the big form. It must have stood nearly as high as a man, with long, powerful forearms covered with coarse hair. Its ugly receding forehead, small eyes and ferocious teeth made it a gruesome spectacle. He pictured the fury landing on the helpless shoulders of Flossie Wren, her pitiful struggles against such a thing. Even athletic Salisbury Quinn did not stand a chance. He drew a deep breath and turned away. "Thank God we got him," he muttered. Then he saw the small, obsequious figure of Dago Tom. The man's face was screwed into a ludicrous mask of grief. He bent beside the big monkey, patting the hairy shoulder, and Larry saw with amazement that the man was crying. "Oh, my poor bozo," he mumbled. "He go for to get to shoot. The poor bozo, he never mean before. Since he a little boy, I know him. He shake the hands with me each morning. He take the bun arm from my fingers. He never mean before the poor bozo. He no more shake the hands." Even after the terrible depredations of the giant bozo, there was something pathetic in the man's grief. Used to animals, he knew their peculiarities, their good points and bad. And Larry considered as he turned away. He doubtless loved the awful thing. Well, the big case was over. Chicago breathed deeply in relief. The terror was gone, the menace removed. People were free to go and come as they willed, with only the necessity of guarding against gentlemanly hold-up men and well-mannered thugs. That was the daily and nightly problem of Chicago dwellers, to be expected, a danger recognized and understood. But the unknown, the bizarre, the thing that lurked in shadows and leaped in the dark, that was gone. Chickagay stretched and yawned. What was the next excitement? The dismal October evening darkened. Toward early night, crowds from the elevated surged off at each station as the local roared westward toward Austin and Oak Park, finally leaving its high position to take to the ground as they neared the end of the run. Patrolman Daly strolled easily along the street, watching idly the homeward-bound crowds of city workers. He felt satisfied and at peace with the world. Daly had been detailed to watch the elevated station since the two sensational murders, but with the explanation of them that very day, he realized that need for increased vigilance was over. He need no longer walk his beat with tensed nerves and watchful eyes. A heavy fog was rising. He shivered and pulled his coat closer. On such a night, Salisbury Quinn had been killed. And also, that poor girl, that devilish ape, seemed to pick foggy nights, but now it was dead. He had viewed the giant beast, the danger was gone. A self-respecting policeman could attend to his duties with gentlemanly leisure. It was a devilish night, he decided, near 11 o'clock, when the outlying district had all the appearance of a well-behaved country town. He sauntered past a candy kitchen in which a few boys and girls were drinking chocolate. Past the darkened bank, the windows of a curio shop. He narrowed his eyes and peered through the fog. It made things look unreal. The streetlight striking on the black window of that curio shop, lighting vaguely a grinning idle thing. Ugh. Daly shivered. He was getting notions. He knew Old Lee Chong well. Most of his curios came from Halsted Street. Suddenly the officer turned, for in the stillness he thought he heard stealthy steps, though the dimly seen street showed nothing. He went on. Again he got the unpleasant impression of being followed. He turned and walked quickly back over the way he had come. A belated pedestrian came into view before him, a small, shabby figure of a man hurrying on about his own business, a cheap suitcase in his hand. The officer passed him with a quick greeting. The clock from the bank corner tolled midnight. Daly yawned, glad that he would soon be relieved. The town was asleep through the fog. Trees looked like giants. The shadowy pillars of the elevated loomed grotesquely. Something brushed against his feet, and he jumped back with a startled curse, a small black kitten seeking company. The big man growled deep in his throat, surprised to find that his heart was beating furiously. Disgusted with what he considered unpardonable weakness, he drew well within the shadow of the elevator to steal a forbidden drag on a cigarette. With the suddenness of death, he was dealt a terrific blow on the back of the head. He staggered, dulled senses registering the shocking fact that again the horror had struck. This time, however, it was a different proposition. Accustomed to violence and rough-and-tumble fighting, Daly put up a powerful resistance reaching above his head. In spite of the terrible clawing fingers at his face and neck, he seized two long, stringy arms. God! They were covered with hair. He tore the gasping, stuttering thing from his back and dashed it to the pavement, but before his reeling senses could assist him, it was back. Seeming to be possessed of superhuman strength, burrowing in between his blows, sinking sinewy fingers at his throat, uttering guttural grunts and cries. His gun was useless, but he fought with the frenzy of desperation to keep the thing from his throat. Blood was streaming from his torn face, and always those awful fingers prodded, clutched with almost his last conscious breath. He seized his whistle and sent a long shivering cry through the foggy night. With a final tear at his jugular vein, the menace leaped for the stanchions above his head. Ape, gorilla, gurgled Daly with his dying breath to the second policeman, O'Reilly, bending over him 5 minutes later. Chicago was stunned. Its fancied security was gone. The horror was loose again. The death of the ape bozo had not checked it. People talked of it on trains. Men discussed it at luncheon. The police roused from their short complacency. Most of all was Larry O'Toole struck dumb. "My God, O'Reilly, couldn't you see a thing?" The men were crowding around him at headquarters the next morning. "Well," O'Reilly took up his story, "I heard the whistle just as I was turning the corner above the lake station by the corner drugstore. Shaw and I hurried over and found poor Daly all bloody and dying, just gasping his last. He muttered something about gorilla or ape, and that was all." "Wasn't there anyone about at all?" Larry put in hopelessly. "No. You see, it was midnight and, b'gosh, there was a little wizened fellow with a paper suitcase hurrying up the Lay's steps as I dropped poor Daly and scouted around the corner. Mild-eyed little fellow he was, said he was a-taking the last train into the city. Vaudeville performer he says he was, just finished his trick at the Alcazar. Asks me what's wrong. "Officer murdered here," says I. "My God," says he, "can I do anything?" "No," I says. "That damned horror has struck again after we thought he was dead." I was glad of his company for the minute. I'd already turned in my call and soon help comes sure. And it's an evil spirit, a banshee. "What became of the little man and what did he look like?" O'Toole asked impatiently. "Oh, he was a slightish fella. Funny, dazed-looking eyes and nervous hands, wore a frayed gray suit and talked kind of thick nothing doing. There, Larry, that chap couldn't have killed a cat." Larry nodded a speculative look in his eyes and soon left the station. He smoked countless cigarettes and wandered aimlessly for hours, thinking. He was dazed. The explanation of the escaped ape had so fitted into things. He had felt proud of his work, so confident that the menace was laid. Then out of the peace and security came this third crime, striking down a man like Daly, a giant of a man, versed in ways of violence. Larry groaned in disgust, then straightened to attention. Ahead of him, in the crowds of State Street, He caught sight of a slinking figure that he knew. He also had seen the nimble fingers steal to a comfortable-looking purse on the wrist of a fashionably dressed woman and come away, the purse neatly clipped from its chain. Unconsciously, the lady went her way. Larry slipped through the throng, following the man until he turned down a side street. Then he caught up with him. "Wait a minute, Lifter. I've got you covered." With a whine, the man turned. His narrow, whitish face leered into O'Toole's. He squirmed, trying to hide the purse, but Larry laid a hand on his sleeve. "At it again. Can't be decent, can you?" "Lifter. Well, we'll put you away for a stretch this time." "Ah, say, O'Toole, have a heart. I'll give it back." "Cut it. We fooled with you enough." He collared the man and started off briskly. Suddenly, the fellow jerked his coat. "Say, Larry, listen. If I can turn you a bit of info, will you let me go?" "Not on your pretty face, Lifter." "Something big something you want to know?" "I know all I want to. Not about this. About that horror business." Larry glanced quickly at his captive. "What you trying to pull, guy?" "Nothing. Hones. To Gord. I got some dope. Come to my dump and I'll spill, if you'll let me go." Larry considered. Eyes narrowed. He knew the value of crook dope, knew how these denizens of the underworld gathered information for which the authorities might search unsuccessfully. It all depended on whether the man was stalling. 20 minutes later, he was facing the lifter across, a dirty, littered table in his cell-like room on Lower Halsted Street. Hones. To Gord O'Toole. "That's straight. I was a-stalkin' the dame, 'cause I see she was alone and had a nifty poke. I got on the L when she did, and when she got off, I did too. I kept out of sight and she never knew I was there. All I was a-goin' to do was lift the thing and beat it, see? Not hurt her or nothin'." He blinked in self-righteousness. "It was the same with Nickel Dick. He was a-tellin' me about it. He trailed that guy from that house where he'd been for 2 hours layin' for that sparkler he wore." "All right, go back to the girl. You followed her off." "Sure, I heard her go down the stairs ahead of me. I leaned over to sort of figure things out and see if a bull was waitin'. I see her kind of dim. She started to go in, then stopped and pulled back like she saw something. I was about to beat it down when Hones. To guard Larry, I saw something slipping down the rails. I thought it was a shadow, but down it went. Gord. It was awful. Big cat it looked like. I am telling you, man. It had long, hairy arms, and once it looked up, didn't see me, but I am telling you, I never want to see those eyes again. I was kind of struck dumb, thinking Red-Eye Pate's Leica was acting bad when all of a sudden it jumped. I heard her squeal, heard that thing growl, the shifty eyes dropped. "I suppose you rushed straight to the rescue," Larry remarked. "Ah, hell, no, what could I do? I was scared to death. I hunched down and listened till it was over. Then I heard the L coming and thought if anyone found me they'd think. Anyway, I beat it down the stairs and had to go past that girl to keep out of the light. What became of the thing? I dunno. It wasn't there, but I found this." He pulled from a drawer a queer, shining piece of metal. "I thought it might be silver," he added apologetically. Curiously, Larry examined it. It was about 1.5 inches long, curved like a talon, with sharp edges. At the base was a solid ring. Absently, he slipped it on his finger, then stared, fascinated. "Good night," he said softly. The lifter nodded, satisfied that he was earning lenience. And Nickel Dick, he'd been trailing that guy for 10 blocks, but it was always too light, or there was a damn bull around. He glanced swiftly at his auditor to see if the slip had counted against him. And then the guy stopped under the L and Dick was about to pull his stunt when something dropped out of the framework. Dick heard it squeal and grunt, then he beat it. He didn't wait like I did. Larry sat before the fire in his room, staring at the bit of steel he had come by so curiously. He was at the end of his deductive ability. Two thugs on different occasions had seen two people set upon in widely differing parts of the city by a dark, hairy thing leaping from the shadow of the elevated, and one of them had retrieved this ring. His fine theory had blown up. Poor bozo had doubtless been sacrificed in a useless cause. He probably had hung around the vicinity where he was killed, frightened and hungry, until the officers had finished him off, and the horror, whatever it was, human or fiend, continued its maraudings. Larry sighed. He knew the precautions that had been taken, the lighting of all elevated crossings, details of extra policemen. But in his heart he doubted if it would work. For all their watching, the thing would strike again and again. He got up impatiently. He was growing morbid. Near midnight, an idea struck him. He jerked the telephone to him, gave a number, received a sleepy answer, and 10 minutes later was speeding southward in a taxicab. There was one man who, Larry thought, might help him. Alan Henry Moore, professor of psychology at the University of Chicago, had been a friend of the young Irishman since the days when they had sold papers together on Chicago streets. Moore received him wonderingly, clad in pajamas and dressing gown. He was a tall, thin young man with a tumbled mass of blonde curls and particularly gentle grey eyes. Yet Larry knew that in his large, well-formed head was lodged a brain that had few equals for acuteness, power, and penetration. He snapped on an electric stove and started coffee, then sat down and listened intently to what his friend had to say, nodding slowly as Larry unfolded his theory. You think, then, it's a man, subject to spells of mental aberration, committing these crimes while temporarily insane? This thing, he pointed to the metal object Larry had obtained from the lifter. Larry nodded excitedly and slipped it on his finger. Look at the devilish thing, Alan. Suppose you wore 10 of them. They do not interfere with your gripping. See, you could choke a man to death, then lacerate his throat. Alan was smoking furiously, eyes narrowed. You are getting into deep waters, Larry, my boy. We all know the old stories about the werewolf, the creature that at night assumed the form of a wolf and practiced horrible rites. You read of the leopard people of Africa, how they clothe themselves in the skin of the beast and leap from a tree upon the unsuspecting. Those things are shrouded in mystery. Of course, but out of the tangle of myth and superstition, we find a fairly straight thread of mental disorder, whether in savage or civilized man. That such a person lurks in this city is, of course, not impossible. The only person who has been mentioned as being sighted near the scenes of any of the crimes was that small chap with the suitcase, but he was seen only once. Larry interrupted. No, Nickel Deek saw him. The lifter missed him. I looked into that vaudeville business, and there was no such performer on the bill at the Eleazar that week. Still, I don't quite see. You don't see how a small, inoffensive creature like that could overcome a man like Quinn or a chap like Daly. Well, that's a good point, but you must remember that a person under the influence of insanity, so to speak, is noted for his physical powers at all times disproportionate to his size. I have seen a fragile woman who ordinarily could not lift a bucket of coal with ease, tax the strength of 3 men, and a man that under normal circumstances is of little strength, in insane fits requires a straitjacket. You know that. I am not floating in favor of your small grey man, but don't cast him aside as impossible. Larry sighed. Well, it's all theories. How am I going to sift through the better than 2 million souls in this burg and find the small grey man, even if he is the one I want? Alan rose to pour steaming coffee. There is always someone who knows more than we do, Larry, and I know of one man who might help you when I was a kid, studying psychology in the same temple of learning where I now hold forth. He was head professor, a remarkable man, one whose mental powers are limited only by his weakened physical resistance. Professor Menju was forced to retire on account of ill health, and now lives out on the North Shore alone. I don't know exactly what he could do, but I'm sure he would be interested in your theory. He has all sorts of ideas about mental disorders, believes strongly in prenatal influence, a theory which, as you probably don't know, is more or less frowned upon today. Even if he can't offer any working theory, you ought to talk to him. Let's call upon him tomorrow. I'll make an appointment. I'll have time before my first class 10:30. Hit the hay with me, and we'll drive out. Worn out with his fruitless puzzling, Larry agreed and tumbled thankfully into bed. Professor Menjo received them cordially. He had a lovely home nearly 20 miles from the city, a sort of small estate on which he lived, enjoying his flowers and birds. He was a gentle soul, hair nearly white, thin shoulders stooped, hands delicate and fine, eyes merry and wise behind large spectacles. He made his visitors take breakfast with him before consenting to hear a word of their difficulties, then tipped back before the fireplace and gave them his entire attention. Larry could see he held his attention from the first. He tapped nervously on the arm of his chair, ruffled his white hair, uttered quick exclamations oddly animated from the gentle old man who had received them into a small bundle of nervous vitality. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine. Good theory. Excellent. Quite plain. I believe you have it. But now to find him. To find him, I must think." Suddenly he wheeled on Larry. "Young man, you have shown remarkable powers of reasoning, quite above those of the average policeman," he smiled acidly. "Excellent fellows, I assure you, but lacking, not imagination as is frequently charged, but knowledge, definite, scientific knowledge. Now, I must think. There must be some way to locate this poor, suffering creature, for he is suffering. Remember that, if in his moments of sanity he realizes what he has done, he must suffer." He tapped his fine fingers idly, then looked up abruptly. "Young man, give me time. Come back this afternoon." "No, that is too soon." "Wait. Leave me your telephone number. I will ponder the problem, and when I have reached a conclusion, I will call you." With that they had to be content. Larry felt that all the thinking Professor Menju could put on the subject would not lay the horror. He was considerably disappointed. "He regards it just as an abstract problem," he complained to Alan as they were driving back. "I dare say he'll get the fundamentals all worked out, but as to catching the bird, that's another thing." "Give him a chance," Alan comforted. "He's got a remarkable brain. He sits there in his big chair and thinks out some queerer things than you or I could in a lifetime. Give him a chance, that's all." Larry loafed through the long day. He was sick of the sight of newspapers with their glaring headlines. He hated the screaming questions about what the police would do. He considered his theory, which had looked so promising under the light of midnight, as freakish and impossible at noonday. Even if it were not, how would he find the man? He cursed feelingly and lounged back to his room. It was near 9 that evening when the telephone rang sharply. Professor Menju's crackling voice came over the wire. He requested the young man to come out at once. Yes, that time of night he could take the Northwestern Railroad to Lake Cove. The professor would meet him there. The night was bad, a drizzling rain, black clouds scudding across a racked sky. It was a little after 10 when Larry stepped off the puffing local and found Menju muffled in a great coat, awaiting him with a closed car. They covered the 3 miles to the professor's house. In short time, the library looked cheerful and inviting. A light lunch was waiting them, and the professor would not talk until they had eaten. Then he leaned back and fitted the tips of his fingers together. "Now, young man, I have an idea, but it will not work out at once. It requires time, and I want you here where I can consult with you without the necessity of chasing into the city every time I want to ask you a question." I have been thinking deeply, and I am inclined more than ever to agree with your theory, wild as it may sound to some. Now, in the course of my long life, young man, I have collected many strange facts and stories. I will tell you one, and you shall judge if poor Thomas Meeker, whom I knew nearly 20 years ago, might be the man you want. He was a child of strange parentage. His father was what is commonly called a mind reader. His mother was a medium. Now, while both branches are usually practiced with fraud and tricks, both the Meekers possessed unusual powers and traveled over the world giving demonstrations. It is natural that their child should be a bit out of the ordinary. I knew him as a small, retiring chap, forever worrying about something, given to strange fancies. Little off, we called him, and not without reason. What I tell you now I have from the son, who in turn got it from his mother. They were living in Chicago. It was before the boy's birth. And one night they went to a vaudeville show where an old acquaintance of theirs, one Arlo Saxon, was showing with his giant wrestling baboon. It seems that a few seasons before this Arlo and Meeker the elder had had words, a showman's quarrel about appearance on a bill, I believe, anyway. It came to blows, and the baboon suddenly attacked Meeker, who was getting the best of the fight. And Meeker, a very strong man, nearly killed him with a club. The two men patched up their trouble, but the baboon bore a grudge against Meeker, and on this night in question, with the cunning of his kind, he escaped from Arlo and followed the Meekers from the stage door. The beast hid in the steel uprights of a building then under construction and unexpectedly leaped upon the man and, after a terrific struggle, killed him. Poor Mrs. Meeker was a witness to the thing. When she saw her husband dead and the baboon vanished, she fainted. That night, in an emergency hospital, Thomas Meeker was born prematurely. The quiet voice stopped. Larry was conscious of the keen eyes watching him. Is it any wonder that Thomas Meeker was strange, that he entertained peculiar notions all his life, that when he and I in our youth once visited the zoo, he betrayed unusual emotion at sight of a huge baboon? Then you think nothing. I dug this story out of the cluttered storehouse of my widely diversified knowledge. It may have no connection, but the thing strikes one. But where is Meeker? The professor's face clouded. He is still in Chicago up to a year ago. I had his address. I saw him only a week ago. I think he would answer an advertisement from me. He sighed. I hate to do a thing like that, but if he is innocent, no harm will be done. And if, indeed, the poor chap has gone insane and in some horrible way is causing these atrocities, he must be checked. He smiled. I want you to stay the night with me. I didn't call you out here to send you back. I just reconstructed the story and it couldn't wait. I'll show you your room. In the morning, we'll write out the advertisement. Larry rose impatiently. Oh, say, let's frame it tonight. I'll phone it in and get it in an early edition. This can't wait. Monjou smiled slightly. Very well, as you will. This one I have drafted. What do you think of it? Will Thomas Meeker kindly communicate with his old friend Philip Menjou, who has news for him? He toyed with a slip of paper. That last is not true, of course. I am sorry to be the means of trapping the poor chap, but when I think of the awful things he has done, if indeed he has, I sincerely pray I may be wrong. He shook hands with his guest and left him in the pleasant firelit room on the second floor. Larry awoke from a troubled sleep. The fire had died down, and long shadows hung grotesquely from the walls. He realized that his hands were cold, his heart hammering, and a damp ooze of perspiration chilling him. Irritated, he settled again to sleep, but the moment consciousness dimmed, wild fancies leaped upon him. He was walking along a wooded path. the green stillness so intense that he could hear his own breathing. Some frightful menace lurked in the unbroken curtain of leaves. Then, without warning, something leaped upon him. Great hairy arms encircled him. Shaking violently, Larry struggled up. The rain had ceased, and the only sound was the dismal scraping of a branch against the partly open window. He lighted a cigarette and lay back. He would be glad when the cursed case was over. Unhealthy kind of thing. The burning stub fell from his fingers. Terror, like nothing he had ever known, crept over him. Outside the window, something was moving. He forced himself to lie still, staring at that grey patch. Then across it slipped a shadow, long arms reaching. Under an impulse of frenzy, Larry leaped from his bed, reached the window, jerked it open. The cool, rain-washed air touched his face. The cottonwood moved softly with the light wind, that was all. Or had he glimpsed a black form on the ground beneath the tree? He leaned out, eyes straining nothing but the faintly checkered shadow of the moving branches. He went back to bed, feeling easier for the cold handle of his revolver within reach. "Damned fool," he muttered. "The old boy's story got me seeing things. He'll give me the ha-ha when I tell him." After a time he slept. It was near 3 o'clock when he woke again. The moon had given up all attempts to break through the clouds, and darkness, like the bottomless pit, filled the room. For a time he lay still, thinking disconnectedly, wondering at his inability to sleep. Then, with the shock of a cold plunge, he realized that he was not alone in the room. In the far corner, something was stirring again. He forced himself to lie rigid. For a time, nothing occurred. Then he became conscious of a faint, disagreeable odor. Noiselessly, he raised to an elbow. He could make out little beyond the bulk of the furniture and the light glow of ashes in the grate. Then slowly, unmistakably, something came moving across the floor. He heard the light scratch of what? Claws. That was it. The scratching of animal claws. Cautiously, he raised higher, clutching his automatic. Then, with difficulty, he repressed a cry. Gazing at him from the darkness were two round, unwinking golden eyes. He caught the odor strongly, heard a low hissing breath, and the thing leaped. At the same moment, Larry fired. Seemingly, the shot went wild, for the hairy shape landed squarely on him. Powerful arms wound about him like steel. He felt hot breath on his cheek. Caught the gnashing of teeth, fought with all his splendid strength, tore one arm loose, buffeted the awful unseen face, crashed into the hairy chest. But like doom, the thing was gaining. He was helpless in its grip. He never had dreamed such strength existed as those stringy arms possessed. Once he cried out, then cruel talons sought his throat. He felt the deadly pressure, realized that blood was pouring over him. Breathing became agony. Then, with one last effort, he tore at the murderer's fingers. For a blessed moment they gave, then came a tearing sob from the creature. He felt again hot blood pouring over his hands, limp. The thing collapsed. For minutes, Larry could not move. He was fully conscious, felt the loathsome thing across the lower part of his body, heard the gasping breath. Only when all sound ceased did he attempt to rise. Instinctively, he shut his eyes from what the light revealed, then staggered closer to the bed. The huge form of a baboon, but the skin looked strangely loose and flabby. Conquering repulsion that amounted almost to nausea, he turned the thing over. From the hairy folds of skin, he saw the delicate features of Professor Menju. He was quite dead. Yes, man, it was awful. Larry, swathed in bandages, sat comfortably on a narrow cot in the general hospital, while around him crowded Lynch, one or two men from headquarters, a palpitating reporter, and Alan Moore. He told me the story, so calmly and convincingly I swallowed it whole. It was only when I found his confession on the library table downstairs that I got it. He was meeker. He said he knew he'd get caught sometime, but that he could no more help these reversions to type, as he called them, than he could help breathing. He realized he committed terrible deeds during the dark hours, disguised in the skin of a baboon which he carried in his suitcase. Of course, we know the poor devil's mind must have been wrong from that night he was born. He mentioned in his letter how for the last year he had been bothered with strange pains in the head and a growing frenzy to kill. The strange part of it is, Bozo really started it. Menju had been walking and caught sight of the beast climbing through the trees, he says. Something seemed to snap within him. He was crazed with the desire to kill, and that night the terrible plan was evolved. We know the tragic results. I don't know whether he intended to kill me or not when he asked me out there, or why he told me his story. Perhaps he realized it would soon have to end, and wanted someone to understand. He may have just given in to his insane obsession when I was there, or it may have been deliberate. Anyway, he shuddered. "Oh, I want to forget it," he said. "Say, what does this mean?" Tommy Wilkins of the news cut in, pointing to a line of type in the personal column. "It's like this. Will Thomas Meeker kindly communicate with his old friend Philip Menju?" Weary Larry motioned the paper away. "Oh, Lord fellow, take it away. I've had enough." The Lure of Atlantis by Joel Martin, Nichols, Jr. Weird Tales, April 1925. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. There have been so many queer yarns in the newspapers about the sinking of the Nautilus that I, being skipper of the four-masted schooner Brant, which picked up Professor Charles Randolph, her only survivor, had better set down what really did happen down there in the Sargasso Sea. The Nautilus was a steam yacht owned by Professor Amos Tyrrell, a wealthy English naturalist who had built a laboratory on the Cornish coast for the study of fish and seaweed. He and Randolph, who had been his assistant for 20 years, sailed in the Nautilus on the 5th of last February to do some research work in the Sargasso Sea. About this time, the Brant was rounding the Horn, out of Santiago, Chile, with a load of nitrates bound for Charleston, South Carolina. We struck a blow off the River Platte, and my old hooker lost her rudder. When things cleared up a bit, we found ourselves pretty well out in the South Atlantic, but we rigged a jury rudder and headed northwest, figuring on dropping into some Cuban port to refit. We struck the Sargasso about 15 days later, and one fine morning we picked up this Professor Randolph, who was bobbing about in the open sea without the sign of a stick to keep him up. He was delirious when we brought him aboard, but after he came to his right senses, he told me the queerest yarn I ever heard in my life, and I've heard some rather good ones in the 40 years I've been following the sea. At first, I put him down as crazy, but we'd no sooner got him aboard than hell began to pop all around us right there on the Brant. When she finally got through with 2 of her sticks missing, and some of those hard-boiled birds in the Fox are praying to the Almighty to save him from the devils of the deep, I made up my mind that maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. Then I had Randolph write down his story in his own words. I turned the original over to the authorities, and I suppose the British Admiralty has it now, but I copied the whole thing word for word in the Brant's log. The professor headed his story in big letters. Statement of Dr. Charles Williams, Randolph, concerning the sinking of the Nautilus, and this is how it read. Captain Andrew, waters of the schooner Brant, has asked me to write down the story of the cruise of the Nautilus and of what befell her unfortunate crew, and my colleague, Dr. Amos Tyrrell. And since it seems certain now that the Brant is not to suffer the fate of the Nautilus, I have agreed to comply with his request. It is perhaps unnecessary for me to delineate the relationship between Dr. Tyrrell and myself, since we were students of natural science together at the University of Edinburgh 20 years ago. His accomplishments in the field of natural history, his studies and deductions from his exhaustive researches in the Seven Seas, his magnificent laboratory at Bornewell, all have given him an international fame, which no emphasis here from me. Suffice it to say that I may designate myself merely as an unworthy assistant in his great work, a humble satellite reflecting but a dim gleam from the splendor of his genius. The world, when it has read this statement, will realize that these are strange words coming now from me in view of the discord mild term between Dr. Tyrrell and myself, which ended in the horrifying fate of the Nautilus. It was a discord which had its inception 5 years ago, when Dr. Tyrrell exhibited the first signs of a divided interest in his life work. An interest which led him away from his studies of undersea life, and eventually found him devoting a large share of his time to archaeological research. He began this course by taking extended trips to Egypt and Central America, where he indulged in a comparative study of prehistoric architectures found on the two continents, professing to find between them a most amazing and wholly unaccountable similarity. Being engrossed with our original labors, I paid little attention to his assertions, until one day he came to me with the astounding announcement that he had evolved a tenable theory for the existence of the lost continent of Atlantis. In support of it, he produced a vast number of photographs and other data which purported to show that the pyramids found in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula were in reality small copies of the mighty piles found in Egypt, and that, in other ways, he had established an unanswerable argument for there being, in prehistoric times, a bridge of land between the African and American continents. It was his further contention that this land connection was the lost Atlantis, sunk beneath the waves of the South Atlantic Ocean by some stupendous cataclysm. Egypt, in the heyday of its power, he asserted, had been naught but a poor outpost of Atlantis, reflecting only a dim glimmer of the splendors of that lost continent. I must confess that I was bitterly disappointed in my colleague's new activities, for I had always held that the existence of Atlantis was a matter for metaphysical speculation and not one to engage the serious attention of men engrossed in the more objective sciences. I was gravely considering the necessity of voicing this conviction in the form of a gentle reproof to Dr. Tyrrell, when he came to me one day in great excitement, brandishing before my eyes a piece of twisted metal. "I have it, Randolph," he fairly shouted at me. "This proves my theory. We found Atlantis." Dr. Tyrrell was not given to practical joking, so I accepted the piece of metal, although with a preconceived skepticism. It was, I should say, a bit of framework done in bronze, very like the lintel of a door. There are many similar pieces in the temples of ancient Egypt. Carved on its surface, however, were some peculiar hieroglyphics, which, on closer observation, I recognized as a type of cuneiform writing. "Is this one of your Egyptian finds?" I queried, somewhat testily. He waved me down in derision. "This," he said excitedly, "was pulled out of the South Atlantic Ocean on the flukes of an anchor dropped overboard by the tramp steamer Pole Star." "Ah, yes," said I, "a bit of submerged driftwood." "Nonsense," he shouted. "Let me tell you about it. This vessel was caught in a storm somewhere down there. I got the exact bearings, and her anchor was carried overboard by a large sea. It ran out almost the whole length of the cable before they could arrest it. When they finally had opportunity to attend to it, they found that they were anchored. Think of it. Randolph anchored out there in the Sargasso Sea, where the Admiralty charts set the depth at nearly a mile. And when they got the anchor up, they found this bit of bronze twisted about one of the flukes. "A hoax," I exclaimed. "They fooled you for a good price." "I paid them nothing," he retorted. "They believed there was some subterranean upheaval throwing up a submerged island, which by chance caught their anchor. But this bit of bronze never came from any submerged wreck, as they believe. It came from one of the hilltop temples of the lost Atlantis. I have been able to translate this inscription. Do you know what it means? I admitted, caustically, that I did not. It means, he continued, Hey Wynona, fair princess of Atlantis. There is something more, but it is unintelligible. Wynona was the daughter of the last king of Atlantis. Small good it will do you, I put in. You can never prove it. Indeed, he retorted. Then you may be interested to know that I've ordered the Nautilus to be ready for sea in 8 days. I am going down there with our diving equipment, and if it isn't too deep, I am going to explore this watery kingdom. You may come if you wish. To make a long story short, I must say here that I was, in reality, more interested than I cared to admit, and it took no great urging to get me to go along. As Dr. Tyrrell had pointed out, we were already well equipped for the contemplated cruise. The Nautilus, Dr. Tyrrell's yacht, was virtually a floating laboratory in which we had spent many happy months in our explorations of the seven seas. On board was every apparatus imaginable to aid in deep-sea work. Many of the devices had been invented or perfected by my colleague. Chief among these were 2 of the latest type diving suits, glass, steel, and rubber affairs, capable of withstanding excessive undersea pressures. Air was furnished to the wearer from tanks at the shoulders, and thus the danger of entangling life lines and air hose was eliminated. Now, as I write, it seems to me almost a catastrophe that these invaluable accessories have been lost forever to the world. We steamed out of our harbor at Bornewell. On the 5th of February, our voyage was uneventful, and 3 weeks later, we were over the spot indicated in the nautical bearings furnished us by the captain of the Pole Star. How well I remember that morning of our first sounding. How well I remember my own excitement, raised to the zenith by the enthusiasm of Dr. Tyrrell. And how well I remember the look on his face and the leap in my own heart when our sounding lead showed bottom at 280 feet, even as the captain of the Pole Star had said. We had indeed found a submerged island. Whether it was Atlantis, I was still skeptical. On the following morning, after having made the necessary preparations, we donned our diving suits and dropped over the side of the Nautilus into the sea. The spot, as I have already indicated, was approximately in the middle of the Sargasso Sea, but fortunately the surface of the ocean about us for the space of almost a square mile was free of the encumbrance of marine growth so peculiar to these waters. Thus, throughout the middle part of the day we expected to have the full value of the sun, thereby rendering unnecessary our electric searchlights, which were at best rather cumbersome and unsatisfactory for deep-sea work. Once in the sea, with our arms locked together, we sank down, down, down. The water proved to be even clearer than we had hoped. Indeed, it was almost abnormally transparent, and the shafts of the sun bade fair to penetrate quite as far as we desired to go. We must have been descending slowly for nearly 5 minutes when suddenly Dr. Tyrrell loosed his arm and pointed with his gloved finger into the distance at my back. Turning my head within my helmet, I saw with a tremendous leap of my heart that we were floating slowly down beside a beautiful tapering pinnacle, cut in a stone which appeared to be marble. Almost immediately other and lesser pinnacles arose gradually about us, all of them glowing with vari-colored tints under the penetrating rays of the sun. Peering at some of the nearer ones, I saw that they were not some mere basaltic upheaval. They had been built by human hands. We had found Atlantis. The luminous glow from above had grown only slightly dimmer when we came gently to rest on what appeared to be the roof of some gigantic building, a roof which, on closer observation, I saw was of a thick but lucid crystal. All about us, on a kind of ridgepole of this temple, if such it was, I saw bits of curiously carved statuary, some of them apparently broken off by the undulating action of the deep sea currents. I would have paused over them in wonderment had it not been for Dr. Tyrrell, who, without hesitation, walked deliberately to the edge of the roof, where we again dropped off into the open water. A moment later, we filtered gently to rest on a wide landing in a magnificent set of marble stairs. Glancing up with thumping heart, I realized that we were standing at the very threshold of a splendid marble temple. I would that I had the time or the talent for describing the magnificence, the awe-inspiring beauty of that scene. The walls, towering up before us, were of purest marble, slightly tinted, a bluish green by the intervening water. Above our heads, the shafts of the sun, only slightly dimmed by the lesser depth, played on those lofty spires with all the colors of the rainbow, tints shading away in degrees of green, yellow, red, purple, and blue. All about us on the stairs, standing for the most part on pedestals of what appeared to be pure gold, was some of the most exquisite statuary I have ever seen, saved for a few pieces carved in the form of some hideous beast, the like of which I have never seen on earth. The majority of the effects were extremely pleasing to the eye, and were evidently from the hands of the sublimest masters who had far surpassed the best of Phidias or Praxiteles, or the unknown author of the Venus of Melos. And yet the effect in totality was marred, as I have indicated, by the weird shapes of some of the beasts. Then, too, there was a peculiar type of fungus growing over them, a kind of seaweed unknown to me, which writhed and moved about the statuary like a thing alive. Some of it seemed actually to be coiling and uncoiling about the throat of a beautiful maiden, exquisitely carved in a pinkish marble standing near us on the stairs. While I was charmed with the statuary, I must admit from the outset that this strange marine growth made me shudder. It was too uncannily alive. Even as we walked up the steps, it recoiled from our footsteps to make way for us. But on looking back, I noted that it returned again to its original resting place and seemed, in fact, to be following us up to the top. At the head of the flight, we found a pair of magnificent bronze doors, fortunately wide open. Oddly enough, both were heavily embossed with the figure of a winged animal, not unlike the Egyptian Sphinx, part woman, part beast, and part bird. Although the doors were open, there was a tangle of that disgusting marine growth across the threshold, and Dr. Tyrrell, with a gesture of impatience, drew his knife to hack away into the place. But even as he reached out to seize the stuff, it recoiled and parted of its own accord, thereby giving us ready access. Behind the bronze doors was a magnificent hall or foyer. I do not know how else to describe it. Halfway down on our right was an open doorway leading into another and more spacious hall. Light from the ocean surface filtered into the place through the crystal roofs, but its intensity had been so greatly dimmed by the depth that we could not see clearly for more than 20 feet ahead of us. Keeping well to the right so that we should not lose our way, we suddenly came face to face with the wall of the temple, noting with a gasp of admiration that its surface was covered with beautiful murals, apparently done in gold leaf, with backgrounds of silver, and a substance which might be ivory. Following the murals to the very foot of the walls, I noted that the floor on which we were walking had been done in the most delicate and intricate of mosaics. We feasted our eyes on these beauties for several minutes, and then began following the wall at our right. I was in the act of commenting, mentally, on the absence of any furnishings or statuary in the hall proper, when suddenly there loomed before us in the greenish gloom a sizable marble cubicle, coming nearer. We saw that this was only the first of a series, mortised to the walls, and standing about as high as our waists. A farther approach showed us that they were, in reality, a row of marble bins, to use a prosaic term. But what bins they were! What beauty! What contents! Pounds and pounds of jewels in every hue of the rainbow. In one cubicle, I buried my arms up to the elbow in the finest of rubies. From another, I saw Dr. Tyrrell hold up a double handful of glittering emeralds and diamonds, a king's ransom in those alone. My natural cupidity had seized hold of me, and I was for taking some of the gems with us. But I noted that Dr. Tyrrell, always the scholar, had tossed his jewels back into place, and then I shamefacedly followed his example. As we wandered farther down the hall, he informed me, in the sign language we had developed for undersea work, that he had concluded this was a mortuary chapel built on one of the Atlantean hilltops. If such it proved to be, he pointed out, we should soon come upon human remains, as the Atlanteans were credited by ancient chroniclers with having developed an amazing method of preserving their dead. He was walking to one side and a little ahead of me as he imparted this information, and he had scarcely finished when I saw him suddenly pause, peer ahead into the gloom, and then hurry forward, signing me to follow. In the greenish half-light, I saw that we were approaching the end of the hall, and that up against the wall was what appeared to be a huge marble altar. And then I saw Wynona, Princess of Atlantis. She was laid out there in her crystal tomb. Her eyes, with their glorious blue, were open and smiling. The roses were still in her cheeks. The very pink was in her fingernails. I suppose I was a bit wrought up, for I could have sworn that she moved and smiled up at us. Dr. Tyrrell had dropped on one knee, his hands clasping the sides of her bier, and now he crouched there, peering through the glass of his helmet at this lovely handiwork of God. I do not know whether he cried out with the marvel of it, but I know that I did, for the sound echoed and re-echoed within the confines of my glass and rubber prison. Never before had I seen so beautiful a creature. A tomb or casket all of clear crystal was tipped upward so that she appeared to be reclining there, gazing out upon the hall below her. I could see every outline of her figure, every lineament of her features. I recognized immediately the Egyptian strain in the firm, straight nose, the perfect curve of the somewhat full lips, and the exquisitely modeled chin, tender yet imperiously firm, but withal, shall I say it, slightly cruel. Her figure, slightly swathed in a filmy lace of gold, was perfection. Possibly a trifle fuller at the hips than we are wont to approve nowadays, but perfect nevertheless. I have spoken of her contours as purely Egyptian, but here the comparison ceases, for your ancient Egyptian was of a swarthy race, but this woman of Atlantis was of the fairest. With wide-opened eyes, as blue as the cornflowers in our native England, and high-piled hair as yellow as the golden fillets with which it was bound. I can see my reader shudder at the thought of thus gazing upon the dead, but I can tell him the sight of the lovely Wynona thus affected neither Dr. Tyrrell nor myself. I do not know how long we stood there gazing at this exquisite creature, but it must have been a very long while, for my heart began to labor and my head began to throb in a way which told me that the oxygen in the tanks at our backs must be getting low. Almost at that identical moment, I felt an uncanny tightening and drawing sensation about my legs and ankles. Glancing quickly downward, I saw something that left me cold with horror. That loathsome seaweed, unnoticed by us, had crept into the chapel and was now seemingly growing in all directions over the floor. Some of it had entwined about my ankles, producing upon them a peculiar drawing and tugging sensation, similar to that felt by a person walking in the undertow on a wave-washed beach. A swift glance over to my colleague produced in me a second and greater wave of horror. I saw him there, lost in contemplation of the sleeping beauty, and utterly unmindful that this hideous creeping thing had gone farther on him than it had on me. Indeed, it bade fair to cover his whole body. During the course of my 20 years' exploration of the world under the sea, I have had many occasions to be terrified by the activities of plant and animal life there. But never have I been so submerged in horror as when I beheld that slimy weed squirming and twisting over our bodies. I must have cried out with the shock of it, for my head began to ring within my helmet, and I clutched frantically for the knife at my belt, with the intention of hacking away the stuff at my ankles. My panic was short. Lived, however, for no sooner had I reached for the weed than it uncoiled itself of its own free will, seeming actually to recoil at the dull gleam of my weapon. Then in 2 strides, I was at Dr. Tyrrell's side, intending to shake him back to a realization of our danger. Twice I grasped his shoulder before he paid the slightest attention to me, absorbed as he was in his contemplation of the smiling beauty in her crystal tomb. Finally, on my last somewhat rough importunity, he turned suddenly about and struck me agog with surprise, with his hand. Almost immediately he must have regretted this act, for he signed to me that he was sorry that he had forgotten himself. For the moment, I told him our oxygen was getting low and pointed to the seaweed on his body, expecting him to be as horror-stricken as I had been. Oddly enough, however, he did not seem to mind it, for he got to his feet, and then, to my profound astonishment, the weed slowly unfolded and left him free. With a last glance at our recumbent beauty, we started from the hall, the seaweed drawing apart before our steps until a wide lane extended before us to the door. Outside on the terrace, we prepared to loose our weights for our journey to the surface. But here a new and greater horror struck me. Glancing down from our high point of vantage before the temple doors, I saw in the mass of seaweed to the right and left of the staircase the ribs, the broken stumps, the twisted stern plates, the battered superstructures of many sunken ships. There must have been at least 100 of them piled together. Helter-skelter, and heaven knows how many more lay farther down in the valley where the rays of the sun did not penetrate. I do not know how long we would have paused there gazing upon this scene of desolation, had it not been that the increased difficulty of breathing warned us we could tarry no longer. Accordingly, we slipped our weights and arose slowly to the surface, the rose and Nile green of the Atlantean spires dropping slowly behind us. Only once did I look down during our journey, and not until then did I realize that the seaweed from the Atlantean temple had followed us, was, in fact, dogging our very heels. The stuff hovered there on the surface for a minute after we had climbed aboard the Nautilus, and then, as if pulled by some unseen hand from below, it slowly sank from sight. I come now to a point in my story where I am loath to continue, for it must reveal in me an atavistic strain, the existence of which, until this last accursed cruise of the Nautilus, I had never suspected. As may be guessed from the preceding narrative, neither Dr. Tyrrell nor myself had ever married, our labors and researches having provided us with a diversity of experience which rendered unnecessary a venture into other fields of existence. Upon the time of the last cruise of the Nautilus, I can say with certainty that no woman, nor even any thought of woman, has ever disturbed the quiet tenor of my emotional life. For my colleague, I think I can say the same. Hence it was somewhat a shock to me when I awoke during that night to find the lovely, sensual face of the exquisite Wynona haunting me there in the darkness of my cabin. For a time, the sensation was a pleasant one. I felt a warm invigoration of my being, a sensuous flow of hot blood in my body which, although slightly tempestuous, was not without a certain indefinable charm. I remember that I reached back to the headboard of my bed, seized there the enamel rail, and stretched myself in the warm luxury of the tropic night. I felt remade, a new thing. I felt that in some indefinable way, nature had poured into me renewed health, renewed youth. I wanted to arise, to pace about my cabin. I wanted to go to the decks of the Nautilus, to race up and down, cloaked only in the star-spangled robe of the equatorial night. I felt that I had the power to reach out and embrace the whole world. For a time I lay there enjoying to the full this entirely new reaction, and speculating on the psychological aspect of my new inspiration. In a little while, however, I began to grow too warm. The hot blood pounding through my veins became, in a very few minutes, a source of complete and profound and wholly inexplicable irritation. In vain, I attempted to throw off the mood. In vain, I attempted all the known tricks of wooing sleep. In vain, I tossed and tumbled about with the gentle rolls of the Nautilus. Eventually, I arose, drew on my dressing gown, for I had thrown aside my pajamas when the mood first came upon me, and thus attired, strode out upon the decks. Forward I saw a tiny ruby glow which I took to be the lighted cigarette of the watch. Above, almost outshone by the brilliance of the Southern Cross, were the riding lights of the Nautilus. All was peace, excepting in my own brain. I strode forward, my irritable mood pricking me onward, and reprimanded the watch for smoking on duty, although I knew such mild breaches of discipline had been winked at by both captain and mate on these long voyages. I remember how, in surprise, he flipped it overboard, the glowing end describing a perfect half circle as it dropped into the sea. Somehow even that bothered me. Presently I walked back toward the stern, and rounding the corner of the after-deck-house, I came suddenly upon Dr. Tyrrell. He was standing there half draped over the rail and peering intently down into the sea. For some reason unknown to me, I paused there, watching him. He did not move. He might have been a statue of stone gazing over the rail. Again, I felt a wave of unreasonable irritation, a veritable sweep of anger. Why should he be standing there peering so intently down into the sea? Why was he not in his cabin where he belonged at this hour, gaining rest for the labors of tomorrow? Somehow I did not realize then that I was blaming him for the very thing which I myself was doing. As I stood there watching him, he slowly straightened up and lifted his eyes to the stars. His lips were moving, and I thought that he sighed. It was then that I noted, seemingly for the first time in all our relationship, what a handsome figure of a man he was. With his clear-cut, aquiline profile, his full-molded chin, his crisp, curly hair, only slightly tinged with grey at the temples, and that magnificent figure with its tremendous shoulders, flat hips, and gently sloping flanks. Somehow, it made me feel small and puny and hopeless. All my newfound vigor drained from me in that moment, and I felt a strange, hot resentment against the man. Suddenly, I had come to be old and worn and gnarled and terribly weary. Thinking thus, and without disturbing my colleague, I went back to my cabin and a sleepless vigil into the dawn. That morning, while we were taking breakfast, Dr. Tyrrell told me quietly that there would be no need for my going down that day. Why? I asked, somewhat testily, though never before had I questioned his decisions. It is exhausting work, he replied, and we do not know how long we can stay here before there may be a storm, in which case we may have to up anchor and run before it. I think we can work best by going down in turn. I today, you tomorrow. His reasoning seemed wholly spurious, but I assented sullenly. Throughout the 4 hours of his trip below, I lived in torture. I thought of him down there, walking through those magnificent halls, enjoying the wonders of Atlantis, the attractions of the ancient chapel, the charm of that smiling beauty there in her crystal tomb. Vaguely I wondered what he would bring up with him, and you may guess that I was somewhat startled when he came up, as he had gone down, with nothing at all. That night, for the first time in our long friendship, we had harsh words in his cabin. I upbraided him for bringing up none of the jewels, pointing out that even if he himself had no need for further wealth, some of the rest of us were poor men and could put them to good use. My remark seemed to anger him greatly, and he lost himself in a mighty gust of wrath. "They are not ours," he thundered, towering over me. "Not one jot nor tittle of them shall we take. They are hers. They belong to Wynona. You shall not have them." "You are mad," I raged. "You are inhumanly selfish. You at least owe it to these poor men aboard who could be made independent for life. It is not within your right to deny them." All my raging was of no avail, and the next morning I was only partly surprised, though greatly angered, when he told me curtly that only he would go beneath the waters. And for another 4 hours I sat there on the decks of the Nautilus, suffering the tortures of the damned. And again he came up empty-handed. That night we went at it again over the teacups. I raged, I tore, I stamped about the room, but he answered me with gentle words, or, more often, not at all. For the most part, he was peculiarly silent, almost uncannily pleasant. When I had finished my tirade, he got up, but paused on the threshold of his cabin. "Fear not," he said with a peculiarly quiet smile. "They shall have everything. Every foot of Atlantis shall be theirs. They shall climb its hills, wander through its halls, sun themselves on its terraces. They shall know its every beauty, all its wealth. But for you, my friend, I can promise nothing. You are not wanted down below." His cryptic remark startled me, and I began to wonder if he were not a little mad. That night I lay awake through all the long hours until dawn, thinking not of the jewels of the wealth in Atlantis, but only of Wynona. At dawn I slept a little, and she came in all her gorgeous beauty, and mocked me there in my cabin. That day I vowed it should be I who would go below. In that I was vastly mistaken. However, we quarreled at the rail just before he went over, but he brushed me back and plunged into the sea. I saw his face laughing up in derision through the glass of his helmet as he slowly sank from sight. For perhaps an hour I sat there by the rail until the strain became no longer endurable. Then it was that the bonds of my respect to Dr. Tyrrell's judgment were broken, and I realized of a sudden that there was nothing to keep me from going down, even against his wishes. Thinking thus, I got myself into my diving dress and slipped over the side. I landed, by good luck, about halfway up the stairs to the temple. There again before me I saw that accursed seaweed, but I spurned it quickly aside and climbed the stairs. At the entrance, the wretched stuff attempted to bar my way, but I drew my knife and slashed at it until it drew back. Then I walked into the foyer, and from thence into the chapel. Somehow I knew I should find him there, and I was not disappointed. As the details of the farther end of the hall were revealed to me, through the dimness I saw him kneeling before that altar with his head down across her crystal tomb, his face behind the glass, in his helmet pressed close to hers. And then I knew that I hated him. Hated him because he loved her, and because I loved her, and because, in some way, I knew he was the favored one. For the first time I realized that I, too, had cared nothing for the jewels, that I, too, would have scorned to rifle her chapel. Always it had been Wynona, and now he had taken her from me. I hated him with every spark of my soul, every fiber of my being. "Dastard!" I shrieked. "Thus you have beguiled your time, thus you have hoodwinked us all." I had forgotten that the sound could not penetrate beyond the confines of my helmet, and now it echoed and re-echoed within my steel and rubber prison, ringing and screeching in my ears until the very blood seemed to well up into my eyes, and the sea before me was as scarlet. Without thought of what I was about to do, I pushed forward, knife in hand. I would kill him there. I would cut him down with as little compunction as I had the seaweed before the portals. But I must be crafty. I had no intention of giving him a chance in fair fight. I would walk up behind him and strike with my knife through the rubber joints at his throat, rip the blade downward to his breast, and leave him there either to drown or bleed to death. How I would laugh as he died there at the feet of his beauty. What an outcome for his secret tryst. And then a very strange thing happened. There was no way under heaven that he could have known of my approach, for he was kneeling with his back toward me. There was nothing to warn him, no sound from me that could have penetrated that watery space to the ears within his helmet. Yet, while I was still 20 feet away, I saw him get slowly to his feet and turn about, his hand going to the knife at his belt, even before he could have realized my purpose. Thus confronted, I brandished my weapon and bade him in our sign language to be prepared, since I intended to kill him or die in the attempt. Scarcely had I finished when, to my utter astonishment, he slowly replaced the knife in its sheath and quietly awaited my coming. Taken back though I was, I had no intention of losing my purpose. His very sureness enraged me the more. I strode forward, bending all my weight against the intervening water, holding my blade in readiness. Now I stood before him and saw his white, sneering face behind the glass, shrieking aloud with a strange exultation. I raised my weapon to strike, but I never made that stroke. Even as my arm descended in its murderous errand, I felt myself suddenly and helplessly snatched away. It was that accursed seaweed. The damnable stuff had twined about my body as I strode across the hall, and now, as I drew near enough to plunge my weapon home, it had snatched me away. In vain I foamed and fought it, slashing to the right and to the left. In vain I ripped and tore and cut, using my gloved hands where the blade seemed too slow. Where I slashed off yards of the stuff, new tendrils seemed to grow, enveloping my body, frothing and screaming, kicking and squirming. I was dragged across the hall and out on the steps before the temple. There, despite my weight, the weed seemed to gather under me, forcing me upward. In but a few minutes, the slowly receding spires of Atlantis told me that I was on my way to the surface. I lay on the bosom of the sea, kicking and screaming, but that diabolical stuff was determined that I should not sink again. Finally, as all strength seemed to be leaving me, I felt myself hauled slowly out of the water. They on board the Nautilus, seeing me struggling there in the water, had slipped a boat hook under the ring at my belt and were pulling me to her decks. That I was crafty. Once on board, I revealed nothing of what had happened, merely pretending that I had been taken with cramps on coming to the surface. Then, very carefully, I laid my plans to kill Dr. Tyrrell as soon as he should return. Secretly, I got out my pistol and a knife and watched for the ascending bubbles that would tell of his coming. But he never came. I waited there until dusk, waited until the captain came to me in alarm and begged me to go below in search of his missing employer. I should have been glad to go for another purpose than he thought, but I knew that devilish seaweed would stop me at the outset. Looking over the side, I could see it lurking there, waiting once I was in its clutches. It could hold me there powerless while my quarry came aboard in safety, and my last chance was lost. But I could not tell them this, so I cut a rent in my diving dress, telling them it would be impossible for me to venture below. With the coming of darkness, all thought of my leaving the ship was abandoned, and Dr. Tyrrell's life was despaired of. For myself, I knew that he was still down there keeping his tryst with Wynona, and the thought of it made me fairly boil with rage. As the night wore on, I became exhausted with the play of conflicting emotions, and, pretending an illness, I went to my cabin. I must have slept longer than I had intended, for I had many long dreams in which I saw my colleague in the arms of Wynona. The two of them stood there, on one of the pillars of Atlantis, mocking me as I struggled with the weeds of the Sargasso. Each dream brought the stuff nearer my throat, while it shook and crushed me as if I were a rodent in the grip of a python. It had clutched my shoulders and was shaking me again when I awoke and saw that I was not at the bottom of the sea, but safe in my cabin with the captain of the Nautilus grasping me frantically by the shoulder. "What is the matter?" I demanded, bounding out of my bed and wondering if Dr. Tyrrell had slipped back during the watches of the night. "The ship is sinking, sir," he said, his voice all a tremble in the darkness. You'd best come on deck. There is something wrong. I don't understand it. The man's teeth were actually chattering, and the tones of his voice struck me into a panic. As I stood there, peering at his white face in the gloom, I noticed for the first time that the floor of my cabin had assumed a noticeable angle. The ship appeared to be no longer responding to the roll of the seas, but wobbled and tugged in an uncannily impotent way. Hastily donning an overgarment, I hurried out on deck. The night was starlit, the ocean smooth save for the gentle undulating billows from which it is never free. And yet the Nautilus was going down by the head. Already the angle of her decks had assumed a higher pitch, while I had tarried there in my cabin. At that moment, she assumed a slight list to port, the wobble becoming more accentuated with each billow. In the forward part of the vessel, there arose a wail of voices from the throats of terror-stricken, helpless men. I turned angrily to the captain and demanded why he had not set the crew to the pumps. "I've tried that, sir," he answered, "and I found there isn't a drop of water in her hold." "It's her anchor, then," I said. "It's probably caught on the bottom, and the rising tide is pulling her under." I am not a nautical man, and this seemed an adequate explanation. "I had the anchor up an hour ago," he answered. "I tried to pull out of here, actually tried to get her underway, but her propellers won't budge her." "My God, sir, it seems that we're being pulled down. We actually can't move." At that moment, there came a ripping and creaking sound from her hold, followed by another drunken wobble to port. And that, I think, gave me my first inkling of what was really happening to the Nautilus. Running up into the forward part of the ship, I peered over the side. What I saw there pulled a strange cry of exultation from my throat under her bowsprit, and I dare say, all along the whole length of her keel were little sucker-like tendrils protruding from the water, worming and squirming their way upward over her smooth white sides. The Nautilus was in the grip of the Sargasso seaweed. She was being pulled under, to Grulantis. Now I understood that gruesome pile of wreckage so far below. I realize that when the world reads this, it will call me mad, and I think for the next few hours perhaps I was. I sprang into the air, I jumped and leaped about the deck, I shouted for very joy. I was going to fool Dr. Tyrrell after all. He had said Atlantis would not take me, but it was taking the Nautilus, and if it took the Nautilus, it must take me. The crew must have gathered from my yells and exclamations of triumph what had happened, for they left off their wails and went to work with hatchets, knives, and axes. The weed, by this time, had crept up almost to the rails, and now, as if realizing it had been discovered, it actually began swarming over the side onto the decks, and eventually into the masts and rigging. They, poor fellows, chopped and hacked and fought it through most of the night. It was a losing fight. Inch by inch, her bow tilted downward. Inch by inch, her rounded stern arose toward the heavens. Once they tried to lower her boats, but no sooner had these touched the water than the seaweed fastened its clutches upon them. When the angle of her decks became impossible for further footing, I climbed to her stern rail, where I perched and howled and shrieked in glee. Ah, fool that I was! I had forgotten that Atlantis did not want me. Had I been more clever, had I had more of the cunning of the day before, I should have hidden myself away somewhere in the bowels of her and gone down with her to the very depths. She went down at dawn with a dull creaking of strained timbers and a hoarse, despairing gurgle and whistle from the air expelled from her holds. And I, fool, perched there on her stern rail, shrieked and shouted for the very joy of it. One by one, I saw their bobbing heads go under. One by one, I saw the last bits of wreckage enveloped by that slimy, creeping thing and engulfed forever. At noon, at night, I was still floating on again, and again I dived, seeking to entangle myself. Again and again, I felt myself thrust backward to the surface. The sun, a blistering ball of copper in the sky, sank lower and lower, and with the coming of the night, I believe I must have slept there, on the bosom of the Sargasso Sea. There were other days and other nights when I screamed and writhed in raging impotence, for I had come to realize that the sea was only playing with me, waiting there idly for me to die when I should be carried far from Atlantis and Wynona by some swift current. But on the dawn of the third day, a great ship hovered over me, and even against my will, I was saved. I come now to the end of my story. I know that the world will judge me mad in the writing of it, but for the world and its judgment I care nothing, for I know whereof I have spoken. I have yet another and longer story to bring to a close, and as I set this down, I plan to write my finis to it out there on the decks of the Brand. Of this Captain Waters knows nothing, for I have his promise that he will not read this until tomorrow. Therefore, on this third day of March, I hereby set my signature to this my story, Charles Williams Randolph. After a while I saw him going below, and I didn't find him until afterward. We were pretty well loaded up with Chilean nitrates, valuable stuff, and so I held on to her cargo as long as I could, hoping we might get her clear. But after a while, I saw it was no go. With the cargo out of her, I knew she'd be harder to pull under. But on the other hand, when she was empty, it would be easier for that stuff to pull her over on her beam ends. But it was nip and tuck for our lives then, and to hell with the cargo. So I gave the order for half the crew to open her hatches and get the stuff out. It was in powdered form and packed in sacks, 300 pounds to the sack. We began getting it up as best we could, and no easy job it was, with the list on her and the wobble and all that slimy stuff a-squirming over her both aloft and below. We'd dropped about 20 or maybe 30 bags over the side, when one of them broke and spilled into the water. That was what saved us, that bag breaking over the side. I was standing by the rail helping the men when I saw it spill into the water, and then I noticed there was a hissing and a boiling all about her where the stuff had gone in. And that weed, it just melted away all around her waterline for the distance of 10 feet, curled up and dropped off. That gave me my idea there was some chemical reaction in that nitrate which was death to that seaweed. I grabbed the next bag and knifed it open, and we dumped it in. Then I was sure the nitrates would do the trick. Well, sir, we just quit fighting that stuff with knives and axes and went at it with those nitrates. We sprinkled it all over the ship, fore and aft, and then we put the whaleboat over the side and sprinkled the stuff against her sides, and as far down as we could get below her waterline. Pretty soon the weed in the rigging began to dry up and wither away, and then she began to roll a bit instead of wobbling. Another 6 hours of it, with most of the cargo overboard, and we were clear. We still had some canvas on her, and a little breeze came along and pushed her out of there. I thought maybe Randolph had thrown himself overboard and had not been noticed during the excitement, but the next day we found him hiding in the afterhold. He said he was waiting for the ship to go down, and that nobody would fool him this time. When I told him she was clear, he began to cry like a child. Then I got him up to my cabin and set him about writing his statement, but I'd forgotten he had a mania for making away with himself. I suppose I am to blame for that. He went out on the deck afterward. I didn't see what happened, but the mate said he climbed up into the mizzen shrouds and then threw himself down. Not into the water, but upon the deck. When we picked him up, he was conscious, but dying. I felt sorry for him. Poor devil, he called to me as he lay there dying, and made me promise that I'd bury him as soon as he'd gone. "I can walk back by myself," said he. "I know the way. I'll find her." Well, what could I do? I promised. He went about half an hour later, smiling a goodbye. We sewed him in, in one of those sacks, put some scrap iron at his feet, and let him go. I suppose he's down there now, and I hope he found her, whoever she may be. Thank you so much for hanging out today. My name is Sol, and this is the Pulp Archive. Now, if you had fun, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps. And like most stories we cover here, today's was recommended by you. So, if there's a story you'd like to see, send us an email at pulparchivelibrary@gmail.com. We'd love to cover it. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep us going, consider subscribing to our Apple channel or becoming a member on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/pulparchive. For as little as $5 a month, you'll get access to all our podcasts and private explicit episodes that wouldn't be allowed publicly. We feature almost every genre of pulp fiction, horror, detective, western, and even sports. Special thanks to our patrons who make the podcast possible and make every episode of the Pulp Archive happen. Every episode is dedicated to our Patreon members. I truly could not do this without you.